Come on in, folks. We're just about to get started. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure some people will come in a moment late, but I don't want to wait too long. So welcome, everybody, to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 272nd, being recorded on Thursday, September 24th, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern, we've got Dan Skaggs, who's going to talk about isolation is a good thing for your local development environments. And that's great. Thank you for coming on, Dan. And before we get started, I just want to clarify, look down at the bottom of the screen. Spread the word to folks. You're here. Great. Love to have you. But other people literally don't know about the ColdFusion Meetup, and you want to let them know. And ColdFusionMeetup.com is the easiest way to get there. Just redirects to the Meetup site. And then all the sessions are recorded, and they're on YouTube, and the specific links are at recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and welcome Dan and let him take it away.
All right. Thank you, Charlie. Let me get my screen shared here. So, Charlie, you should see the screen share icon to be able to enable that, I think. Outstanding. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me on. I want to say hello to a bunch of very familiar users that I see logged on. It's been a while since I've seen some of you, and that's on me. But it's good to be back and get to talk to you again. So we're going to talk a little bit today about some tips and tricks that you can use to make your local CF development environments more flexible and, dare I say, even more fun. I know you all have fun with CF anyway, but we're going to try to ramp that up a little bit. So first, a quick thing for those of you that I have not met. Way back in the day, I was a longtime CF dev, both as a company employee and independent consultant. I built one of the first browser-based optometric practice management systems based on CF and Postgres, and ran that for a few years. So that was very enlightening, and I learned a ton by running a SaaS type product. Not long after that, I kind of caught the AngularJS bug, and I started moving into doing front end development work, and had a ton of fun with AngularJS and Angular. So kind of took me away from the CF world and into the magical world of JavaScript and front end development. I've spoken at several meetups and conferences all over the States, and had a lot of fun doing that too. These days, I'm more pointy-haired boss than I am code slinger at this point. I manage several full stack teams for a global media company that shall remain nameless, but is easy to find out if you care. I also do some part-time DevRel and DevOps stuff as part of my job. And probably the most fun thing I get to do these days is we have a large inner source, and I'll put that in quotes there, effort going on to try to change the way that our various engineering teams within the company work by using processes and tooling that large open source projects, public open source projects use. And it's been really interesting to be involved and shepherd that as well. A little bit more, I'm a big home automation geek. I love self-hosting apps. I've got a stack of servers in the next room over here that runs a bunch of stuff for me. My son and I have recently started playing through a bunch of classic video games and streaming that online. So that's been a big learning opportunity for me. Contribute to various open source things, have some of my own, and probably least interesting to most of you, as I'm a massive Kentucky Wildcats fan. Mostly basketball, but football's been coming on the last few years, so we're getting on that bandwagon too. So, why are we here? From time immemorial, whenever we get ready to set up a ColdFusion and development environment, what do? We go and grab an installer. And whether it's CF5, which is the oldest screenshot that I could find, and I think Adam Cameron is in attendance today, so thank you very much for hosting that on your blog post. I stole it. From CF5 to MX to 7 to 8 to 11 to even up all the way up to the 2018 release. We go and grab an installer for our preferred operating system, whether that's Windows or Mac OS or whatever. And what does that thing do? It puts files all over the place and gives us a working CF install, right? So that's all well and good, but what happens if you're in a situation where maybe you're a consultant that have clients, various clients that are on different versions of ColdFusion, or maybe you don't. Maybe you've got one app, but you want to see if it works on the next version, maybe the public beta of the next version of CF that's coming out. It's not real easy to do that on a single machine with an installer like this. So I'm going to talk to you today about doing some work with technology called Docker. And so to make that a lot easier and a lot easier to spin up new devs, or your machine dies or you get a new one and you have to recreate your dev environment, make that quite a bit easier. So what if I was to tell you that with 6 lines of YAML configuration code, you could have a ColdFusion application server up and running inside a Docker container simply by typing that single command? You might not believe me. Hopefully you will. You came to listen, so hopefully you will. So I'm actually going to prove it to you right now. So let me go over here and let's look at some code. So I have that. You should be able to see, hopefully, the VS Code window. I have that same 6 lines of configuration in here, and I'm going to get over into a terminal window. I could do it from terminal here, but I want a full screen terminal window, and that's the wrong terminal. Let me alt tab the right one. There we go. So I'm going to type that same command, docker-compose up. We're going to wait a second because we're going to download some stuff. Because we've told Docker, hey, I want to stand up a container based on this image that is at that bintray.io address. Docker looks and says, hey, I don't have that image, so I got to go get it. And, it takes a bit. It's fairly fast for me. I'm lucky enough to have fiber to the house here, so it doesn't take too long to download. But the next time we do this, we won't have to download it. We'll have it locally, and it'll just use it. So you can see some log file outputs here. We're starting up. It's checking for a serial key. And then down toward the bottom there on the screen, you'll see it says ColdFusion 2018 server has been started. So here we go. Sorry. So we're done, right? We can go and have a longer lunch, and ColdFusion is up and running, and we're all good to go. Well, as is usually the case, not really. It is true we have ColdFusion running in a container, yes. Can we get to the CF admin? No, we can't do that yet. Can we have ColdFusion actually process our code? Nope, can't do that either. What happens if we need to get under the hood and we need to get into log files? We don't know where those are, don't know how to get to them. And most of our apps use a database, right? So we haven't told it about any database. We can't get in to configure a database, so it's not going to connect to it yet. So we've got some work to do to actually get from where we are to where we need to be. So let's talk right quick about where we are at the moment. We absolutely have ColdFusion running inside a container on the Docker ecosystem. Docker has very helpfully created an impenetrable fence all the way around our ColdFusion application server. Let me put that in there, our CF app server. So at this point, it is utterly and totally useless to us. We can't get to it. It can't get to us. It has this fence around it. It's happily sitting over there doing nothing, but it's literally worthless to us. So as we go through this, we're going to add some other configuration things to try to get some of those other checkboxes you saw on the scorecard in the previous slide turned over to the green. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get to CF admin, and then to do that, we have to be able to browse, right? So I can hear you saying now, but Dan, you just said that there's an impenetrable fence around the CF app server, and I did. We're going to add a little bit of configuration that is essentially going to create a gate in that fence that is going to allow TCP traffic on port 8500 to go through. And the significance of that, obviously, any of you that have used the CF standalone server, you know that the web server that stands up as part of that is listening on port 8500. So by opening this, and I'm putting the word gate is not in the standard Docker lexicon, but we're going to use it for illustrative purposes today. By opening this gate for port 8500, you can then get into Firefox, in my case, Chrome, Edge, whatever your preferred browser is, type localhost :8500 and get into hit the CF, the web server that is inside the Docker container. So we can get to the administrator and we build on being able to do some other stuff. So why don't we take a look and see what that looks like? So I'm going to very quickly, and there we go. I'm going to unceremoniously stop our pretty worthless walled off instance of this thing. And I'm going to check out step 2. Hold on. So what we're going to do then is we're going to add a little bit of configuration. And now that we've checked that out, let's get over to our code. You'll see 3 extra lines. We had 6 before, now we got 9. So there's a couple things I want to point out in the environment variables. In order for this thing to even start up, we have to set a couple of environment variables on the container. The first one on line 6 was there before, the accept the EULA, to set that to yes. Otherwise, CF won't, it'll just bomb and tell you no, it couldn't start up because you didn't accept the user license. Line 7, we have set another environment variable named password with the string my password, so that ColdFusion will pick that up and use that as the login for our ColdFusion administrator screen. So that's important. It's not the most interesting thing here, though. Remember I told you about the gate, right? Well, that's under this port section down at the bottom. And this is interesting because we are configuring this so that everything on the left-hand side of the colon is applicable to our local host, our host machine. Everything on the right side of the colon is applicable to the container itself. So we're saying map port 8500 on my local, in my case, Windows machine. I'm using Ubuntu inside Windows Subsystem for Linux, but it doesn't matter. Map port 8500 over to port 8500 inside the container and make that gate and connect them two together. So if everything goes well, now I do docker-compose up. We'll wait for that to start just a second. Usually it doesn't take too long. There we are. Let's find my Mozilla Firefox window and let's go to localhost 8500 CF IDE administrator. And if the demo deities are kind to me, and momentarily, once that stands up, you should see a login page. There we are. It's zoomed pretty badly, so apologies for that. And I'm going to type in that my password string that we put in our configuration file. And it's going to do its initial little quick finishing configuring the server. And voila, here's our CF admin. So we've gotten one step farther on, right? So if we go back and we check our scorecard, now we can get to the CF admin, but we still got a lot of red on here. So the next thing to look at is, can we use our own application code? And before I move on from the step 2 running container, I'm just going to do a quick check of localhost :8500. Now, we don't know what that is. That's not my code. That's being served from somewhere, but it's not mine. So for this particular instance, we're still in the red as far as that task goes. So we'll go back and we will stop that particular container, and we will check out step 3. and go look at what that does to our code. So we've got two other lines, one new section and one new configuration. Underneath our ports where we mapped that gate, we're going to set up a connection to a folder. So ColdFusion is set up to the Adobe ColdFusion images are configured to expect your application code to reside in a folder off of the root file system named app. Now this is inside the container. So Adobe CF images run on Ubuntu, and so it's a Linux sub file system. So it expects your application code to be in a folder named app that it exists off of the root. So in order for us to be able to get our code in there easily, and I'll stress easily because there are ways to do this, but you don't want to do them because they're a real pain. We're going to actually have Docker set us up another gate. And in this case, we're going to map our project root. So in when we get back to VS Code, you'll see this the root of the project there. There's an app folder that we're going to map and say, use the app folder in my VS Code project root and make that the same as the /app off of the root directory inside the container. So let's take a look at how that works. Under this volumes, that's what we're doing the mapping. Under this volumes, we've got this kind of shorthand here, this $PWD curly brace thing. That literally is a shorthand for whatever the current directory is where the Docker Compose file is being run from. So you'll notice over on the side, I have an app folder and I have some stuff in it. And I'm telling, again, with the colon, the left side is host and the right side is the container. With the colon on the left side, I'm saying current directory /app, map that in to be the equivalent to the app directory in the root of the container file system. So let's go over back to our handy dandy terminal. Do docker-compose up. And that's going to start up again. You notice as we're doing this, like I mentioned, it's not downloading that image again because it's already caching it for you on your local machine. You're telling it to use that particular image, and Docker says, oh, I already have a copy of that. I don't need to go grab it again. We're just going to use it from the disk. So now that CF is up again, let's go back to our Firefox, and I'm going to hit refresh on this localhost 8500. And momentarily, you're going to see, courtesy of your friend Dan Wilson, who gave me this non-trivial sample app, Sub-Awesome Contacts, so that I didn't have to write all of the app and do the presentation. You'll notice that we have filtering. I can go and create a new contact, and we're moving around inside our ColdFusion application that's being served from within the Docker container. So we're making progress, right? So let's go back. And I want to give you a note on the file paths. I'm doing this from within, like I said, Windows Subsystem for Linux on an Ubuntu image. So I'm working in a Linux command line. So what you see there, the curly brace PWD, we explained that. If for whatever reason you're not using Windows Subsystem for Linux and you're just doing this on native Windows, that also works as well by just doing the path to whatever folder on the left side, mapping to whatever directory on the right side. The only caveat is you need to turn your slashes around, and that works just as well. You can map to whatever in Windows directories, and Docker will take that and run with it, and it'll work just fine. So I've been a long time Mac OS user up until earlier this year, so I'm very comfortable with Bash and terminals and stuff. So I choose to do all of my development for this thing inside Windows Subsystem for Linux. You absolutely do not have to. You can totally do it natively on Windows as well. So if we then go back and look at our scorecard, hey, we've got 3 check marks, and we're moving right along. We can browse to the admin. We can hit our oops, I just hit a wrong button and skipped ahead a little bit, but that's okay. That's what's next. So the next thing on our agenda is what happens when things go wrong. Like, how many of you have built an application where you didn't have to look at a log file and nothing went wrong from beginning to end? I'll take silence as a nobody, because at least I have never done that. So at this point, we're browsing in port 8500. We have our app code mapped in, and we need to be able to see the log information that CF is generating. You know, we want to be able to see what the errors are and be able to log stuff ourselves and custom logs and things. And so while you can do that from the CF admin logs entry page, to me, that's not as handy as it should be. So what we want to do then is we want to go back and add some configuration to, you guessed it, we're going to make another gate, and we're going to have the logs folder in our project root be mapped to the location where ColdFusion is going to write its logs. Now, the little curly brace and ... you see there is just a shortcut, because that's a really long path and it wouldn't fit beside my graphic, but we'll see where that is in a second. So let's take a quick peek, and so we'll cancel step 3 here, and we will check out step 4. Okay. Go and look and see what that does to our code. Doesn't change it a whole lot, and you might have guessed already what it was going to do. So again, our current working directory /logs for our host, and then that path that we mentioned where CF is going to be writing its log files, opt ColdFusion CFusion logs. So as far as the container is concerned, this opt ColdFusion CFusion logs is right there. It doesn't know, nor does it care, that it's actually putting stuff onto the host's disk drive. Doesn't care at all. So let's take a look and see what that looks like when we docker-compose up. I'm going to let that run. I'm going to pretty quickly flip back over to VS Code. And if all goes like I expect it to, we should start seeing some log files output over here. Yeah, there we go. You can see them getting created. So now it's a lot easier for us to be able to get to the log information that we all need from time to time to be able to debug errors or to see what's going on under the hood of this thing. And that's all because we've been able to use this drive mapping, or creating a gate in this terms for this presentation, to be able to get that code or those files out of the container and get them somewhere where it's a lot easier to access. Now you can actually exec into the container with Docker tools. We're not going to get into that too much today. So you can exec into it and tail them and do all kinds of stuff in there. But then every time you restart it, you have to re-go in there again. It's just a pain. So I prefer to pull them out to my local system and keep them there. The one thing I will mention, you may notice that these things are grayed out. So it's important, if you're going to do this and you're going to be in any kind of a source code management like Git that I'm here, is to set those up to be ignored. And whether that's SVN ignore or Git ignore, whatever you're using, I've gone in and I've said, ignore everything in the logs folder except this git keep, which is a little placeholder file that when you clone a repo, it makes sure that those folders get created. And so pretty much ignore everything in there and don't try to put them in the repo. So we can open one of those. Let's do CF outlog. I don't typically open them in VS Code because they don't refresh, and if they get written to, you don't know about it. But just to show you that here's the log information that ColdFusion was writing. All right. Now, I mentioned not refreshing. So what I typically do is I will, again, because I'm a Unix type person, Linux person, I use a tool named tail. It's an executable. You can see there the command tail -f and whatever you want to tail. And what that'll do is it'll print the last 10 lines of the file and then sit there and wait, and it'll add on as new things are added to the file. Just this week, for those that are Windows native and not in WSL or on a Mac, I found out, learn something new every day, right? I found out that PowerShell has an equivalent, this get content server log, and then the tail 8 tells it to print the last 8 lines, and the wait flag does the same thing. It'll sit there and wait, and as new lines are added to it, it'll automatically display them. The tail 8 is pretty important here because if you don't put that, it prints the whole thing. And that's, it can be a bad thing if it's a big log file and you just kind of want to know what gets added to it. So anyway, that's a little tidbit. I won't charge you anything extra for that. In case you didn't know it, that was a neat little find that I learned this week myself. Okay. So at this point, come on, go forward. There we are. So we have logs and we have an app and we have a port. What you might not have noticed in this demo that you absolutely would if you use this very much is that as you're bringing up and destroying and bringing up these containers, if you've gone in and made any changes to the settings in the CF admin at some point or other, and maybe as often as every time, you're going to get hit with the fact that you lose all of your settings. Your data sources go away, any caching settings that you've changed, any timeout settings, any of that stuff that you've changed gets back defaulted. So that's obviously less than productive to have to manually recreate all that every time. So what happens, we've had ColdFusion archives, car files for seems like eons. And in my opinion, those have been underused over the years. I know a few people that have used them to do things, but by and large, everywhere I've been, those have been ignored. So Adobe has set up the images so that any car files that are in the /data folder inside the container will be automatically applied on startup. So how do we get car files into the /data? Well, if you've been playing along with us, you probably already guessed we're going to set up another gate or another mapping. And we're going to map the data folder from our project root into the /data folder inside the container. So let's stop our step 4, I believe. Okay. Git reset. Git checkout step 5. Okay. Now let's do a Docker compose. Before I do that, let me go over and find the browser window. Yeah, here we go. So this is from when we started up a few minutes ago. If I refresh this right now, it's not going to work. But if you notice here, this is the default timeout request after 60 seconds. For this particular demo, I created a car file and I didn't change anything. I just set this to 30. That's the only thing I changed out of the whole CF admin. So I wanted to point out before we do this that the default for that timeout request after seconds is 60. So let's go and do a Docker compose up. And we're going to watch the logs as we go because we're going to see some interesting stuff go by after ColdFusion starts up the first time. So it's coming. It says it's been started. And here momentarily, you'll see some extra entries that we haven't seen before as it goes and looks in that data directory to find any car files that we may have sitting out there and that we wanted to process. And as we're waiting and waiting, come on, machine, let's go. Here we are. Okay, I don't see my, yeah, there it is. Importing, it put it on a line up here. Importing data CF Docker demo.car. Then if you keep looking down, what's it doing? It's stopping the server and restarting it with those new settings that it just pulled in. So now it's started up after pulling that car file in. If I go and load that CF IDE again, once it comes up and I put in the super secret password that we selected in our Docker compose file. Okay. Finish. Come on, finish. And there we are. because I had set that to 30, and then I created a ColdFusion archive with all that settings change in it. Then when we started up CF this time, it found that car file and reapplied that 30-second timeout setting that I had changed earlier. So that's a little bit of a bonus. There wasn't an actual item on our scorecard for that. But at this point, we've got running in containers, browsing the CF admin, using our application code. We can see the log files, and as a bonus, not listed, we're saving our config between each restart. So the only other thing that we identified initially that we wanted to make sure happened was to connect to a database. So let's see what that looks like. So things have moved around a little bit. I had to make some room for this next piece, but it's all the same thing. The ports and the 3 mappings that we did pointing at CF. Now we get ready. You need to say you need a MySQL database. Now, one caveat here is that there's absolutely zero reason that you have to have CF running. MySQL running inside Docker. You can absolutely connect out to external shared databases. You can connect to a manually installed Postgres on your machine or MySQL, MS SQL Server, any of that. So what you gain by having this here is portability and isolation. So some instances you might want a completely separate database that's only spun up when this particular application. You can do that, and it's good to note here that I just chose MySQL as an example. This could be Postgres. It could be Microsoft has SQL Server running on Linux that has a Docker version that you can pull in and use here just the same way. So as you might have expected, because of how these containers store data inside them, by default, if we don't do anything and we load a bunch of data, and we start it up and we load a bunch of data, and we shut it down and we load it up again, that data is probably going to be gone because it's ephemeral inside that file system for that particular container, the MySQL container. So what we want to do is we want to set up yet another gate, and we want to tell Docker says, all right, the default var lib database folder that MySQL uses to put its data files in, put that out on our host file system in the database folder in our project root. So just like we did with the app folder and the logs and stuff, MySQL is going to store its data files out on our host file system. And when you're developing, you almost always, if not always, need your tooling to be able to get to the database too as well, right? So we're going to create another gate on this side for TCP traffic on port 3306 in this case, or whatever the port is for your preferred database system, so that we can get to it with our tooling. All right, so let's take a look and see what that looks like. So let's get over to stop our step 5. Get check out step 6. Okay. And let's look at our code now. You'll notice we've got a lot of stuff that's been added in this, but don't get too worried about that at this point. I'm actually going to start down here in the MySQL line. So before we had ColdFusion and all of its particular configuration items for that service. Now we've added a second container that's going to get started. Call it named MySQL with an image named MySQL. And so MySQL is one of those images that are so ubiquitous that they don't need a very large path. Like if you notice, this one up here gives an entire path to the registry plus a bunch of stuff. By default, this is going to go to hub.docker.com and pull one called MySQL. And they're large enough they think that they can just get by with that. And I guess they are. We're going to give it some environment variables, just like we gave environment variables to CF earlier. My password again for the root user. And we're going to tell it what time zone we want it to be right now. Here's that volume mapping that we mentioned to put data files out on our host system and the ports. Now this command here is just something that MySQL needs to start up to set its default authentication method to regular native passwords. That's fine for development. You may or may not want to use that if you use containers to deploy actual applications and databases. That's a completely other discussion. This topic is so huge that we're literally just skimming the surface. And the last thing I want to point out is that we added this networks bit. And this is like a stripped down basic network configuration that Docker sets up so that these two containers, the ColdFusion container and the MySQL container, can talk to one another. So it assigns IPs, it does everything. It even goes as far as to set up DNS entries so that if you're in the CF, and you will see this in a second, if you're in the CF admin, when it asks you what the name of the database server is, you literally just put MySQL, because that's what we've named it here on line 19. There's a lot of things that you can do with networks to interconnect services from various stacks and all kinds of things. We're not going to talk about any of that because we don't have time, and that's a whole week-long thing to get into. But just know that this networks, we're defining the internal network here, and we're telling MySQL and the ColdFusion containers to attach themselves to that internal network so that they can talk to one another. All right, so let's hop back over to Docker-compose up. And when I hit enter here, the first thing you're going to notice is that it looks pretty different in what comes up on the screen. Okay, so first of all, we don't have the MySQL image, so it's grabbing that right quick. So we'll have it again next time we spin this up. It's done with that. Now you'll notice that our output is categorized by which container is actually putting the log message out. So CF 2018 has been started. Let's move over to our CF admin and log in again since we restarted the server. All right, so we're to there. Let me go ahead now that we have that up, and I'm going to open up MySQL Workbench and bring it into, here we are. I have a previous connection, so I'm going to, just to show you that there is a MySQL server running over there. My password. Here we are. We don't have any databases yet. I've got a couple scripts here just to load some sample data, so I'm going to run those right quick just to load some stuff in, and those are all good. And so now if we refresh our database, and I'm sorry this is so small, I can't really zoom it. You'll see we have an employees database with some various tables in it. Tables, here we go. So we've got some data in there, and that's really all we need MySQL Workbench for the purposes of this demo, but it shows how you can connect in with those port mappings with your database tooling. So let's put him down here, and let's go to the databases, and we're going to create a new data source named employees, and we're going to pick the MySQL driver. Database is also employees. And remember I said the internal DNS that works with those Docker networks, we're literally going to just say MySQL as the server name, root, and our super secret password. Submit. Data source updated successfully. And this is from our old one. I've changed this out, so I'm just going to refresh our index.cfm, and that is literally just a query and a dump to show you that ColdFusion is pulling data from that database. So I'm going to run back over to the config just for a second because there's one thing I forgot to mention. At some point, ColdFusion stopped distributing the MySQL driver with the installer and by extension with the image. So we've got this line here. This looks like kind of one of our standard gates that we've pointed to a directory. However, and let me kind of see if I can shrink that up so we can get it all on screen. You'll notice that this actually points to an individual jar file. So not only can we make volume mappings that are folder to folder, we can make volume mappings that are file from our host system to a file inside the container. So what I've done here, and this is probably not how you would want to do this, in a production type thing, but I've gone and manually downloaded the MySQL driver and put it in this drivers folder in our workspace and map that into the lib directory where ColdFusion loads jars from. And when it started up, it saw it there, did not care that it didn't really exist in on the file system because it was mapped in, loaded it up, and we were able to do set up a MySQL data source using that driver. So that's why that big old long line is there. That was an interesting thing to work through to try to figure out why it didn't work the first time. And then as I got to doing some reading, that Adobe stopped shipping that with the installer. So if we go back now to check our scorecard, we're all green checkboxes. Now, admittedly, I've got some disclaimers here. And the very first one is this is a happy path demo to show the basics of setting up a Docker compose file to use with your CF development. There's all kinds of different ways to set things up. This is just one way that I like to do it because it keeps everything packaged together. I can pull one repo and have all the information that I need to spin up the environment, have the app code there, everything I need in one. I can clone that into a second directory, make a branch, and change the image that I pull for ColdFusion, and very easily test my entire application on a completely different version of ColdFusion and not affect the other directory in the other branch. So I like that particular way of doing things. I kind of learned it from Node and Angular, where your app code is not in your root of your repo, and that's okay. Some people don't like it. I happen to. So this was 100% a happy path demo, just to be able to get this in the amount of time we had. You will potentially see some infrastructure related issues as you're trying to do this. And I can hear you screaming now, even though you're on mute, that, hey, Docker's supposed to handle this infrastructure stuff, right? There's only so much Docker can do. I've seen some issues with Windows and Mac firewall that keep requests from going out. I've seen some VPN configs, depending on the protocols and the clients, keep you from being able to connect to shared databases that are on network. Some antivirus systems, this is getting better over the last couple of years, but at one point, antivirus vendors really didn't like Docker at all. And so that would cause some issues. You may also get some organizational pushback because not everybody is all good with having all this extra stuff in the repo with your code. And you don't have to do it this way. You can absolutely have all of the Docker files and mappings and point your app folder to somewhere else. Again, there's a billion ways to set this up. This is one, and one that I like. So do some research if you run into the organizational pushback of your existing repos and stuff being rearranged. So with that, thank you very much. My contact info is over on the right-hand side. Also active on the CFML Slack. So there's a Docker channel there that I kind of pay attention to. So with that, I'll just leave you with the mission to go forth and Dockerize your entire world. Okay, awesome. Charlie.
Yeah, thank you for that, sir. And we could just leave that up because go ahead and put it back up because people might want to make note of the things that you did there. You might even want to throw them into the chat to help people. So speaking of the chat, I don't think there's any outstanding questions that were asked that you didn't answer. There were some comments made along the way that you might want to take note of, and I addressed them. So I'll tell you what, if you see one that you want to talk about, just let me know and I'll click on it.
Let me, I wasn't watching the.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll grab a couple as we go. So
Yeah, let's do
I
that.
pointed out, but back when you said that all this made for more fun, I just threw in more fun and more productivity with those CF Docker images, and eventually less hassles with config and testing and
Absolutely.
lots of other issues. And you demonstrated that, so awesome.
Plus, you get the satisfaction of using modern stuff that a lot of people are talking about and writing tooling for.
Absolutely. And speaking of modern stuff and tooling, both Sid and Jim mentioned Docker and command box. And that's another whole world of things that you didn't really get into. And one of the things I pointed out was that, yes, they each have their place. There's situations where one could use just the Adobe CF Docker images and not use the Ortus ones and not use command box. Or maybe they meant that somebody might use command box and the CF Docker images separately, and that's true. There could be value to that. Lots of powerful capabilities, and
Yeah,
then I shared how
and
the
I've played with the
command
command
Ortus
box a
images
bit,
are
and
great.
it's a really nice piece of tooling. For this particular one, though, I wanted to go as bargain basement
Sure.
as I could and try to demo the Docker specific stuff itself.
And maybe not even say bargain basement, but again, somebody who only uses ColdFusion and maybe hasn't yet installed command box, hasn't learned about it, maybe feels they can't or won't or whatever. The point your talk is making is, and I've done talks on CF Docker images as well, is that just be aware, Adobe
Yeah.
has Docker images
Yep.
for CF 2016 and 2018. I don't know if you mentioned that. And then, of course, there's the ones coming out for CF 2020.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was using the latest in mine. You can certainly go back and change that tag um, in the Docker Compose file to pull a different image than latest. So it's in fact, if you're developing, it's probably a good idea to tag your development environment the same as your production environment is anyway, so you're not having it change out from under you as they deploy new images.
Yeah, one of the things you'll learn as you work with Docker is the real value in specifically identifying what you want to use and not leaving it to be implicit or latest, which could pull down something new that you weren't expecting and
Yep.
find stuff suddenly breaks. And to that point, I'll throw out for those who don't know, some of the folks here are new to Docker entirely, right? We got to understand that some people listening here haven't done a thing with Docker. Others have used it and are more familiar with, say, the Ortus Docker CF images, or they've used Lucy CF images. So anyway, what I want to say for those who are getting into all this stuff, a great resource is Brett Fisher, BRETFISHER, Brett Fisher, and he does a weekly Docker podcast and YouTube show, and he's got 2 or 3 great full courses on Udemy, Udemy, udemy.com. Just look up udemy.com and then Brett Fisher. And his one on Docker is a great introduction to that. Then he's got one on using Kubernetes, if you get to that. And Dan didn't
Nice.
get into talking about Swarm and Kubernetes and other orchestration possibilities. He also didn't get into, and I'm not faulting, this is excellent. I love the way you did the introduction here. It's great. But I was just going to say, some people are going to be itching and saying, hey, what about running on Azure or AWS or Google Cloud? And you absolutely can. These CF images can be used in those as well. No problem. You can do everything there if you want to. And man, VS Code and Docker Desktop are all getting more and more power built into them to make it seamless for you to be working with your images and containers running in those cloud platforms or locally. There's value to both.
I might mention too, while we're here, on my GitHub, that I'll put that back up in just a second. I actually have a ColdFusion Docker starter that pretty much is the exact same thing that we just did, with the exception of not including MySQL. So if that's something that you would care to grab and look at and dissect and play with, make suggestions for how it could be better or what else you'd like to see, I'd absolutely love to hear from you. And I'll go back over to the slide that has all the contact information. GitHub/dskaggs is where I'm at.
Excellent. And back to finding other resources. I did a talk on getting started with ColdFusion Docker images as well. So if you either go to my site, right, I don't think I've done it on the meetup yet. So if you go to my site, which is carehart.org, You can find those presentations that I gave at CF Summit last year. And you're doing this one, right? I think we can say that, okay, publicly.
Yes.
You're doing
Yes.
this one at the CF Summit coming up in November, which is
Mhm.
going to be great. And you've got more to share that you didn't share. And that's
Correct.
and
Yeah.
I'll add along the way that let's go back to some of the other comments. And by the way, Dan, you jump in with anything you want to say. But in the meantime, I'll go grab a couple more of the comments. One thing I pointed out was that fortunately, a lot of what Dan was covering and that people can learn on their own applies to either kind of image. So again, this wasn't necessarily something that only would benefit those using the Adobe Docker images. And Jim threw in that he was really looking forward to the new modularized ACF and the install setup scripting improvements that Adobe's made, and being able to finally script everything would be fantastic. And I threw in that, yes, indeed, that's coming in CF 2020.
Mhm.
For those not aware, it's in public pre-release now. And I shared the link for going to get there. And Dan was not covering that because he wasn't sure what he could or couldn't say. And I'll just throw out that I have only said things that have been said publicly, and we chatted a bit before the show about how what things have been released and what some of that is, how some of that's going. But anyway, so yeah, that's good stuff to know. It's going to be very different, and Dan will talk a lot about that in his talk. Do you want to say anything now, to the degree that you're comfortable? I mean, if you don't, that's totally cool.
Yeah, so we'll be covering some of the changes that are coming, some of the better things, and I echo Jim's statement. You know, that whole idea is wrapped up in a, for those that aren't familiar with the term, is wrapped up in a term that people call infrastructure as code. So that basically you can check in what we just did and more, and from, in some cases, from bare metal, be able to orchestrate, script the entire thing from bare metal to stand up to a production environment. And you mentioned Swarm. I mentioned in the self-hosting stuff that I do here. I use Docker Swarm with Ansible for automation and all kinds of stuff. So I'm a big automation geek, and anytime that we can set up our infrastructure as code, you've got something that's repeatable, you've got something that's portable, and you've got something that's versionable. And those are three very powerful things that we've been used to using in like production apps. But now we're being able to bring that stuff back into our dev environments and our environments.
There's a bunch of other comments, and I want to get back to the ones from earlier, but in case anybody maybe needs to get going and asked one towards the end, they are newer ones, and I didn't get to respond to them there. So let me jump in. In particular, Adam asked, no images for CF 2020 beta. I'm not sure where that came from. Maybe because I said CF 2016 and 2018. No, absolutely. There's new Docker images for CF 2020. And one of the things that I covered in my talk, because Adobe had announced it, is that they are smaller by far. They are faster to start up, and they will have lots of new capabilities, some of which Dan alluded to, or I mentioned. I threw in saying that with the CF 2020, you'll be able to, there you go.
In order to get that 2020 image, you have to be on the
public
pre-release. You can download
Absolutely.
it from there. Yep.
Yes. So you mentioned, just to bring context to that, where I was going with that, you talked about the car files and how I agree with you that they're lamentably underused. One of the points I made was that it didn't help that the car files were only available for enterprise until CF11. So there's people today that still don't think they can use it, but you can for standard in 11 and above. But yeah, the support for car files and Docker images is great. And I threw in there that CF 2020 will add still more power with JSON configuration, to which Adam replied, is CF 2020 shifting config from those awful XML files to JSON? And I said, no, you'll be able to do either. If you're familiar with CF config from command box, it'll be like it, not nearly as capable, but quite capable.
Yeah, correct. And under the hood, it actually still uses those XML files, I think, but it uses the JSON in place of the car file that I showed here to like hydrate those setting changes that you want to reapply.
Right. So the question is whether we're talking about the mechanism for configuring like an image or configuring the startup of CF. But let's be clear in case there's any confusion. Yes. So the old Neo XML files, and the name Neo goes back way, way back to CF6. Those have not changed. They're still there. But of course, anybody that ever played with them probably got burned if they ever tried to move them from one thing to another. That's not the thing to do. So the
No.
car file mechanism, and I'm just clarifying for everybody else. I know you know this, and I know Adam knows it, but for everybody listening, the car file, the ColdFusion archive mechanism, does itself create a single zip which has some XML files in it. You never look at it. You don't need to worry about it. I thought he was referring to that, about the awful XML files. So the car file mechanism is still there, but yes, this new config capability is going to instead create a JSON file like CF config does. And there's power to both. Again, I said in a comment earlier, there's power to both. It's not to knock one or the other, but people that are using CF alone, it's great to know that CF 2020 is going to add that. And to that, I wanted to point out here on the comment, anybody interested can check out CF20 freely now. It's in public release. You can just look at the docs. If you don't want to install it, that's cool. By the way, I didn't say this, but there's even an option now in CF 2020 to not install ColdFusion. Separate from the Docker images, which Dan showed require no installation. With CF 2020, there is the option to just extract a zip. Boom, there it is, running. So I know people who love to script things prefer that, hated going through an installer. You don't have to go through an installer. And that's one more reason why the new config capability is so important, because obviously if you're just going to plunk it in, how are you going to configure it in a scripting way? Well, you could use the car files, but you don't have to. You can now use this new config thing. And Adobe gave a talk on the CF Meetup last month with more details on this stuff and demos. And that's why I'm comfortable saying these things out loud, because Adobe has demonstrated them. And there's some more comments, but did you want to say anything before I go on?
Just that in the last 4 years since I've been in my current position, we have been 100% developing in, deploying in Docker containers, and creating Docker images and CI builds and all kinds of stuff. We've got 5 different environments that we deploy all of our front-end apps that way, all of our API gateways, all of our back-end API services. Everything that we've done for the last 4 years has been deployed in Docker. So, I've built a ton of them. I've set up CI to build them and modify them and extend them. And so it's one of my favorite things to do is to automate stuff, as you might guess by the intro that I did and what we talked about. And to be able to set this stuff up to where you can just literally get clone and Docker compose up is magical to me. And I have fun all the time working with it.
And it really does make this stuff fun for those who haven't gotten into it yet. When you start to learn how it works, of course, there's frustration getting started, and there's hassles of things you'll trip over that you may find very few people talking about. But Dan and I and lots of other folks are available and getting into this stuff. So don't hesitate to look around and ask for help. Now, before we might lose some folks, I want to address a couple things that you said along the way that might help people that are running Windows. So just to be clear, for those who don't know, one can run Docker Desktop on Windows. The images that Adobe provides and that Ortus provides, and nearly all images, are Linux images, but it doesn't matter, because under the covers, Docker Desktop sets things up in such a way that it doesn't matter that you're on Windows and that the image is Linux. You just have to be aware in some things that, like he showed some paths that look like Linux paths. Inside the container, they are Linux paths, but on the Windows side, you can use Windows paths. Well, you mentioned the $PWD for present working directory, which you mentioned is a very Linux specific thing. Well, I just want to point out, and maybe people didn't catch this while you were saying that, I said you could just say a dot in the Windows compose file. You could say a dot for the equivalent of that $PWD. That's the current directory. So if you had an app under your current directory, dot app would work. And then one other thing, when you mentioned the cool capability to point to a single jar file and map that, that's unfortunately a Linux only thing. That doesn't work on Windows. Yeah, I've tried it on Windows. You can't point a single file. And let me be clear, when I say this, again, I mean when you're running Docker Desktop on Windows.
Yeah, natively on Windows, not in WSL.
And even though the container is Linux, and by the way, right, not natively on WSL. So since Windows 10 update 2004, Docker on Docker Desktop does run your Linux things under the covers on a WSL setup, but it's still, you're on Windows and it's on WSL.
Right.
And I'm saying if your compose file is in Windows, then even then that $PWD doesn't work. The mapping of a single file doesn't work. But to be clear, and this is the cool new possibilities all this stuff gives you, is that if you choose to implement this thing called WSL, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux, and you run everything literally on Linux within your Windows environment, well, then that's all different. Then you're sitting in a
Right.
Linux
And to me,
VM.
having been a Mac user for 17 years and not wanting to come to Windows because it had such a terrible terminal experience, WSL and now WSL version 2, which came up with that 2004 update you mentioned, has made it
Changed the
completely. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best development environment for me, being a Docker and Node and that kind of stuff, because it's best of both worlds.
And then VS Code wraps it all up, which is nice.
VS Code
and really makes
actually, what you were seeing in VS Code was the remote extension.
Good.
VS Code running on my Windows machine, but reaching into the WSL environment with the remote code. I forget what the name of it is, but it was reaching into the WSL environment, but it was running on Windows.
And there's a Docker extension as well that integrates that stuff also automatically. So lots of cool power. In fact, that's another thing we would want to say, is that this does really make all this stuff fun and challenging and interesting, because it's not what it used to be. And there's a couple comments there towards the end there about Linux on Windows still doesn't sound right, and that's understandable. But it is not. It's such a different world. If you're not a Windows person and you don't care, forget what I'm about to say. But if you're on Windows and this stuff intrigues you, it is very different now than even a year ago, and certainly different than 2 years ago, and way different than 5 years ago.
Yeah.
New things about the terminal, new things about the IDE, new things about VMs. Go ahead.
You think that Linux on Windows is bad? You warp your mind when you consider now that you can run MS SQL Server on Linux in Docker.
Well, speaking of that, Jim had a comment about that. I'll let you take a look at that.
Oh yeah, exactly. And so the different versions, like if you've got a lot of shops that are on SQL Server will be on SQL Server 2005 or something, and you don't get those, right? So you do run the risk of having a newer version in development than you have on production, which we've all gotten bit by that. Anybody that's been around and developing for a while has gotten bit by version differences.
Now, along those lines, I made a point earlier. I want to make sure to draw this out. When you were talking about the database stuff and showing MySQL inside a container in Compose, I just want to make sure everybody understands you can talk to a database that's not in a container from within your code or the CF administrator that is running inside of a container. So yeah, if you can't get an image that does the version of SQL Server or even MySQL or whatever, or if you don't want to bother with that, if you've got an existing one and you just want to connect to it, you don't have to containerize it. But the whole point is that if you do containerize it, it's getting towards that infrastructure as code and the isolation that you talked about. So I don't mean to disparage that at all. Just want to say it's amazingly flexible.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things you can do. You can have, the Microsoft SQL Server installed natively on your Windows machine. That Docker will make it available via the network bridges and stuff to ColdFusion inside Docker. I mean, there's tons of different ways to set it up. We don't have time to go into all of them, but that I wanted to show that just so that you could show how to completely have an isolated package and illustrate the network capabilities of doing that as well.
So I shared one comment there that Jim offered, and let's move on to another one since we're running out of time. It's a question for you, and I'll let you address that. It's a very common one.
Applications, and they must all exist below the app folder in the container. I haven't tried that, but my sense is it should be able to, just like if you were pointing to a web root
right.
in a regular, I'll call it the installer version of ColdFusion, right? It works just the same way. That's your web root, and whatever you put under there, you can do mappings and all kinds of things with application CFCs, just like you can on like a traditional installer-based version of ColdFusion.
I'll tell you where this takes things into an interesting direction that a lot of people you didn't cover, and a lot of people will ask as they get into this. And again, he can't cover everything. We talked about that before the talk. I said that at the beginning of my talk. There's a world of things we could talk about. Got to pick something. But a very common refrain I hear from people as they get into working with CF and Docker images is they go, I have multiple websites, and those websites point to different, folders.
Mm-hmm.
How do I do that? And when you're just using the approach that Dan showed, where you're leveraging the built-in web server inside of ColdFusion, and it's looking in that app folder, there's not provision within that to have multiple websites, multiple domains,
Right.
different hosting, but you can absolutely add something else to the picture, like Nginx or
Mm-hmm.
Traffic or other possibility, Apache for sure. And you can get more flexibility, and you can put your code in different places and have that front end, as it were, the front end, the web server front end or the proxy front end, whatever. Different people understand things in different ways. I'm just saying there's a lot of interesting flexibility that just no time to get into in this talk. But as you guys explore this stuff, you'll find there's a lot that you can do.
Yep.
And
Well, I
here's
want to
a
thank you for
comment
giving
from
me
Jim.
the opportunity. Oh, sorry. There was one more question. Multiple
Yeah.
apps in one container, or you could do multiple containers for each app. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So
the
it really
flexibility is
depends on how
amazing.
you want to do it. So, Charlie, I want to thank you all for giving me the chance to come and, yeah, mine too when I started this, Sid. I want to thank you all for giving me a chance to come and talk about this stuff. I enjoy talking about it. I love automation. I can go on and on and on, but there's a lot of people probably want to go and have lunch at this point, and for me to stop talking. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And everybody go check all this stuff out and follow up with more questions. Look forward to seeing more people take advantage of it. Looking forward to you giving this again at the summit. Going to really help spread the enthusiasm even more. So again, thanks very much, Dan, for coming on.
All right, see y'all. Y'all have a good rest of the week.
The recording will be available as soon as I hit the end button. Talk to you guys later.